Though the Civil War battle at Gettysburg was indeed a victory for the North and for President Lincoln, the number of casualties that had piled up created another kind of battle for Lincoln, and that was a battle of public opinion. In this podcast, we're going to understand how President Lincoln dealt with that crisis by going to Gettysburg and giving an immortal speech. My name is Dr. Richard Gardiner from Columbus State University. This is another Muskogee County School District podcast, the Gettysburg Address. There were approximately 50,000 casualties of the Vietnam War over about 15 years. The same number of casualties occurred in one single battle in the American Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg. Although the Battle of Gettysburg was in fact a victory for the North and for Lincoln, people in the North started to grow more and more tired of the war effort, of seeing their fathers, brothers, sons, uncles, and nephews killed in this war. President Lincoln was quite aware that the following year would be an election year. Lincoln was quite concerned that because so many people were sick and tired of the war, they might elect a president in the following year who would just give up on the cause. In fact, there was a political party called the Copperheads whose goal was to get one of their own elected who might simply put an end to the war by letting the Confederate States of America have their own existence. Their candidate was George McClellan, an old Union general that President Lincoln had fired back a year earlier. On September 4th, the governor of Pennsylvania wrote to President Lincoln telling him that the people were turning against his war effort. 4 days later, John Murray Forbes, who was partially responsible for Lincoln's election, wrote to him and said, "Sir, you need to seize an opportunity to speak to the people about the meaning and the purpose of continuing on the war effort." On November 2nd, 1863, President Lincoln received a notice from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that they were about to dedicate the cemetery where all of the soldiers who died in the battle would be buried. And they invited President Lincoln to come and say a few brief remarks at the dedication of that cemetery. Lincoln saw this as his great opportunity to speak to the people. All of the newspaper writers would be there. He would be able to give a message that everyone in the United States could hear about, could read about, and could reflect on. So on November 19, 1863, President Lincoln went out to Gettysburg to give a few brief remarks at the dedication of the cemetery. Here is what Lincoln said that fateful afternoon. He started his remarks by reminding his audience the reason that the United States was founded in the first place 87 years ago. So he said this: 80, that's 80, and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In other words, he's stating that the purpose of the nation's existence was liberty and equality. Next, he told the audience that the very purpose of the Civil War was to determine whether or not a nation founded on liberty and equality could even continue to survive. So he said this: "Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated may long endure." Next, he pointed out the simple fact of where they were at that moment. He said, "We are met on a great battlefield of that war." Then he proceeded to explain the reason that he had been invited there. He said, "We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live." He followed that by saying, "It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. It was at this point in the speech where Lincoln began to say the most important words that he came to Gettysburg to say. Now keep in mind, there was no television, there was no internet. The only way that Lincoln could get his message out was to speak to the newspaper reporters in a very precise and powerful way, that they might write down every word and publish it in all the newspapers all across the land. He knew that they were there listening to him that afternoon. In part 2 of this podcast, we will consider those incredibly powerful words that Lincoln said at the Gettysburg Cemetery on November 19, 1863. But this will conclude this part of the podcast for now. Please watch part 2. My name is Dr. Richard Gardiner from Columbus State University. This has been another Muskogee County School District podcast, the Gettysburg Address, Part 1.